Hi, and welcome everybody to today's episode of the Conscious Grief series. I am delighted to be here with David Waters. David is a psychotherapist, business coach, and trainer. He works with individuals and couples, providing them relief from emotional pain, guiding them to develop self-awareness and healthier relationships. David, welcome.
Well, it's lovely to be here. Thank you for introducing me and for inviting me to be part of this series. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. Well, I learned about you from a dear friend of mine who spoke so highly of your work, and you had been helping her in therapy, and she had realized that the estrangement from her mother was a grief, which she hadn't really kind of put two and two together because her father had died. So that was a really, really obvious grief. And when you pointed out to her that the relationship with her mother was also a grief, that was a big awareness for her. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you would talk a little bit more about these types of less obvious griefs.
No, it's a wonderful question. And thank you for sharing something about, a client, obviously, that's a close friend of yours. I think we tend to think of grief inevitably with, the physical loss of someone dying, of passing away. But of course, grief is actually a much broader emotional experience. We grieve losing a job. We grieve losing a relationship, a relationship breakdown. Grief can come in so many different forms. It's a very potent word. It's a very powerful word. We might feel more comfortable with a word like loss, but acknowledging our losses. We lose things all the time. We lose the summer. We're now into autumn and the leaves are falling, or even winter. And there's a cycle constantly throughout our lives, throughout our day, even, of beginnings, growth, things happening, and then things passing away and leaving. We're very good at celebrating new beginnings and things starting. We're probably much less comfortable with acknowledging the inevitable losses which happen in our lives, and because it's hard work. It's hard work to acknowledge feelings of sadness, perhaps even regret, a sense of something not being able to happen ever again, whatever that may be. So loss and grief are an inevitable part of all of our experiences, but I think culturally we're not so adept at really acknowledging that and really allowing the inevitable emotional work that we need to do in order to process those losses and to adapt to them. And I'm very resistant of words or phrases like getting over and moving on from, it's all done and dusted. It's all in the past. I think, particularly significant losses, they change us. We carry them with us. That doesn't mean that they hobble us, but they change us and they become part of our story and who we are. We can't undo, the inevitably large losses all of us will experience at times throughout our lives. So yeah, I think, a lot of my work is, particularly in the therapy space, perhaps more than the coaching space, is on some level always about acknowledging losses in some way and giving people that I work with, my clients, both the understanding of that, but also the space to allow those emotions to be acknowledged, spoken about, processed, and kind of faced, which takes courage, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that perhaps when people get to that place where they really start feeling a lot of the pain, there can be a temptation to think, oh, I don't like these sessions, I'd rather opt out. But that's really where the growth comes and the healing. So how about the people, who are really in that place of feeling a lot of pain? What would you say to them about sort of remaining committed to the therapy and working through it, continuing to show up?
Well, that's a really great question. I often say at the beginning of a contract with a new client, whatever they may be coming to see me for help with, that, I would love to say, each time we meet, things will feel a little easier and you'll be on this sort of endlessly, upward trajectory to the sunny uplands. Inevitably, that's not really how it works. And that would be a very unrealistic expectation. And to your point, which I think is absolutely right, particularly if grief is explicitly part of the work, things may well start to feel harder and more, painful before they may hopefully eventually start to feel a little lighter and more bearable. And I think, managing people's expectations at the very beginning, I think is very important. So actually, if a client does start to feel, really quite sort of perhaps even overwhelmed or really struggling with some of the, the difficult emotions coming up, that they'll have some kind of trust in the process that they will stick it out. Because I think over time things will start to become more bearable and it will start to lift again. There's a brilliant work by Sigmund Freud from 1917 called on Mourning and Melancholia. And he says this really important, makes this really crucial point in that book, which is mourning is work. To mourn, to grieve is work. It's emotional work. And if we don't do the work, and I think work is a really interesting word because work feels sort of heavy and a bit sort of ponderous and, something that we have to sort of roll our sleeves up and get on with. And I think in a way, grieving is like that. If we don't do it, and it's so tempting to run away from it because it's so painful, it lurks and it sort of festers and it will come back. And it might come back in a much more painful and difficult way. Some small little incident happens and we're absolutely floored by it. We're overwhelmed by, a tiff with a partner, because it exposes some kind of sense of loss, because actually there's a much bigger loss from our past which we haven't fully acknowledged and processed and in a sense done the work on. So we become quite vulnerable, I think, moving forward if we don't do the work. So I think that's a very powerful and useful concept when it comes to grieving. We can postpone, perhaps we can distract, we can maybe get away with that for years even, but at some point, if we don't do the work, we're going to be quite hobbled, I think, emotionally in our lives.
Yes. Oh, I love all of that you've shared. And when we had our sort of intro call, if you like, you said a couple of things that really stuck with me, and it was how grief changes us on a molecular level. And it's sort of like we lose our emotional virginity, which I thought was so great. And what you're just sharing now, it's making me think about if we do the work, and how can the process of grief shape us moving forward in your experience?
I think we're all different. I think, my grief is my grief. It will be experienced in some ways, I'm sure, very similarly to other people's grief, but also it will be uniquely my experience. And I think, we would love the idea. I mean, it's very tempting to be seduced by this idea of sort of getting over, moving on from, letting stuff go, because they really appeal to our sense of we can return to something that feels like how we were before the major loss, whatever it may have been, whether it's, a parent, a loved one, a close friend, the loss of a significant relationship, whatever it may be. But I think, if we can perhaps be more modest in our expectations and accept that, this loss will change us, and, we won't be the same person. That doesn't mean we'll be a lesser person. In fact, in some strange way, we might be kind of enriched by that experience. We become, more mature. We become more seasoned as a human being in a way because of the richness of our experiences, including our losses. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I mentioned it briefly on my website without going into too many details, but, I went through a very painful relationship loss 20 or so years ago. And, really, really devastating loss, a relationship that had lasted for 14 years. I really thought it was going to be there forever. And it wasn't in a very dramatic way. And a friend said, I think you might need to speak to someone. I was like, no. I was very kind of not anti-therapy, but it was not something I thought I would ever have to embark on myself. And I had some therapy, and it was perhaps only for 3 or 4 months, but it was profoundly helpful. And it gave me a genuine sense that I would be able to survive this, and I would get through it. It would change me. So it was actually through a loss myself that actually opened the door of just the power of therapy, and also inevitably led me to start to train to become a therapist myself. So through that sort of terrible time, really, an actual amazing, for me, opportunity arose, which I could never have expected. And I genuinely feel would never have happened had I not gone through that loss. So it changes us. And that change can be, hard and difficult. But I think once we do start to make more sense of our lives after a major loss, in a strange way, I guess my hope is that we, acknowledge that there is something enriching about the experience, not that we would wish it upon ourselves again or upon anybody else, but we can accept that it is part of our lives that we've gone through this, and it is something that we can carry without it constantly kind of dragging us down to a dark place.
Absolutely. And I was thinking back to what you were saying about intentional mourning as well, and how that is work, but what I'm doing in my grief groups is kind of like 11 weeks of intentional mourning. And then through that, an awakening occurs. And it's not the same for everybody, but there's certainly a transformation, as you said, if people are really willing to see what grief has to teach us, and then you become more robust in terms of dealing with the next loss that happens, which is inevitable. It's always amazing to me how many of us sort of live thinking that bad things shouldn't happen to us. Why do we just naturally feel like any bad thing is like, how dare that happen? That shouldn't happen, when in a way it's sort of part of the course, surely.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really powerful point. I just think, what's my take on that? I just think culturally we're just not terribly mature. Our culture is full of more stuff, and just have this amazing car and everything will be brilliant. It's just like we live in a consumer culture and a consumer society, and that's very seductive. And to some degree, many of us, or most of us perhaps, are all seduced by some of those bright, shiny things, and that's fun and wonderful in a way. But it's not the whole story. Life isn't just bright and shiny. It has darkness and pain and sadness. And actually, if we're more mature about accepting that inevitability of in a sense, the shadow of life, or the darkness of life, in a sense, those shiny things might become brighter because we know that they're not always there. So it can actually enhance, in a sense, all aspects of our lives, rather than just constantly thinking that, well, life's meant to be brilliant all the time, and if it isn't, then that's only something that happens to other people. That can't possibly happen to me. And it's like, well, it will happen to you. I'm sorry to say. I don't say that with, with any kind of, sadistic pleasure, but, none of us are going to avoid losses. That's just the fact of life. And the more we're able to sort of acknowledge that, to some degree, accept that is part of the experience of living, and in a strange way, part of the richness of our experiences as creatures on this planet, then, I think it prepares us to some degree. And I don't think we can ever be fully prepared for some of the bigger losses in life, because they can just really, knock us for six. But we're perhaps a little less in a kind of ivory tower of naivety and innocence about how the world really works and what's inevitably going to happen to us at some point.
Yes, maybe it's Disney's fault too,
Simplification of life, exactly.
Yeah. But it was actually making me think what you were saying about the consumer culture and capitalism. I was reading something the other day that was like desire is basically, we have to have desire to keep the capitalist culture moving. And I wonder if, like, with the pandemic, whether that shifted people's perceptions a little bit. Like, perhaps we don't need I know for myself, for example, because I'm at home so much that I barely buy clothes with the same enthusiasm as before. And we need less.
Nowhere to go. There's nowhere to wear them.
There's nowhere to go, apart from my, top half.
No, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think, inevitably with the pandemic, with various lockdowns, with all the challenges pretty much everyone on the planet has had to face, there's been some huge questioning of so many things, about work and relationships and who we are and what's important to us and, where should I really be putting my energy? And it's come up a lot inevitably in my coaching work and also my therapy work as well, of people having the space perhaps to think in ways that they hadn't done before. Where are they living? How are they living? Talk about offices not coming back, although they seem to definitely be coming back, but maybe a sort of hybrid way of working. And we've all collectively experienced a huge loss through the pandemic, which is the loss of our normal ways of living and working and being. Lockdown inevitably was a huge loss of our, normal routine, a loss of our, bonding with colleagues at work and our, traveling to work and being in offices and all those kind of, things which weren't always wonderful, but they were part of, the everyday lives for so many of us, were just whisked away very, very, brutally in a sense. So it was a very frightening, disruptive time. And I don't know that we fully processed really the emotional toil of all of that, because we've just inevitably needed to get on with stuff. But I think collectively we've all had a huge trauma actually, and then just the day-to-day of living with how we manage our boundaries around meeting other people and what feels safe or doesn't feel safe, and mask wearing and not mask wearing. It's just every day is a kind of challenge in a way that we never had to think about before. It
truly is. It truly is. And like you said, I don't know whether we have necessarily processed it or realized the impact and the hope that things will return to normal, this new normal that was phrased, which is kind of so curious to me, because it's very much like grief. You become a new version of yourself. And I think there is this expectation that, as you mentioned before, that we want to return to the old us, and people around us often want us to be that the old person as well, and it's just not the way that it works.
Absolutely.
Now, you also mentioned, in your coaching and in your therapy, some people watching may never have had either, and I'd love for you to tell us what's the difference between having coaching and therapy.
That's a great question. I think, the kind of, I guess, the textbook version of that, I think I'll speak about it in terms of, what the differences are, and then perhaps for me, how I navigate those differences, because obviously I work with a range of people seeking different kinds of support. Coaching inevitably, particularly in the business sphere, obviously is primarily focused on work and how someone is managing their career and perhaps managing teams, the inevitable challenges of working in complex organizations. So coaching generally is focused on the here and now and helping people get to wherever their goals are, what they're hoping to achieve, Inevitably with the work I do in the business and the corporate world, that is often about progressing their careers, building their business, finding greater, more successful business success for their teams and their organizations. Therapy, particularly the therapy that I've been trained in, which is called psychodynamic therapy, which is looking at unconscious processes, is much more interested in, how did I get here rather than how do I get there? So it's curious about someone's past, their attachments, their sort of family dynamics, experiences they had growing up, challenges they had to inevitably face and overcome through their sort of maturation and becoming adults, and how that might be negatively impacting on their relationships in the here and now. And really thinking primarily about the relationship I'm building with my client and how that might unconsciously be reflecting on how they're relating to others in their lives based on these past experiences. So, and that doesn't mean that, within the therapy space, we can also be thinking about where their hopes are and what they might be hoping to achieve and so on. And inevitably for me, because I do have this therapy background in the coaching space, I'm also very comfortable inevitably talking about someone's past if it feels relevant and necessary as part of the coaching. So I think for me, because I sort of wear two hats, I don't think there is an absolute hard line between those two ways of working. But I think just for people who've not experienced either, or perhaps one but not the other, in a very kind of shorthand way, coaching is here and now and focused on tomorrow. Therapy is more likely to be thinking about how did I get here, and thinking, or certainly giving significant space to the past and unpacking that past and processing some of those issues to do with the past.
So if you had somebody who was experiencing grief or a complicated grief and they came to you, would you suggest therapy or coaching?
Well, because I primarily work in coaching in the sort of business sector, I would absolutely say therapy would be a more appropriate space, because it would inevitably be thinking about and helping that person think about what that relationship really meant to them, significant moments in that relationship, really giving space to the emotional fallout of that loss, the sadness, the regret, the pain, the anger, the huge, range of emotions that are big, or as you say, a complicated loss. And a complicated loss can need a lot of work and space and time, a very ambivalent relationship, a relationship where perhaps things hadn't been said that needed to be said, but the person's now gone. And where do you go with that? Perhaps you didn't really tell someone how much you love them, and then they're no longer there to express that to you. So you sort of carry this sort of, terrible sense of guilt and frustration that these important things weren't expressed. How do you manage that? It can be very, very complicated.
Mm-hmm. And when do you find that people take a little time to cry? Like, I always find it interesting how people always apologize when they start crying. Oh, sorry. What's your experience? I don't know. Also, it'd be interesting to know where your clients are primarily. I'm sure they're all over the place, but are there a lot of English ones? I'm curious.
That's so interesting. I've never been explicitly asked about crying, actually. I mean, what's been interesting about the last couple of years, because pretty much all my work now is conducted remotely, and the sort of almost the cliche of the therapy room is the sort of box of tissues within sort of arm's reach of the client's chair, which I certainly always had when I was working in person in my therapy room in London. I've actually moved around. I was in London, and then I was in New York for a number of years, and now I'm actually based in Paris in France. So I've sort of moved around, but the inevitable box of tissues, which I have to say were often used, by both men and women, and not necessarily people who are expressly coming to seek help because of grieving, but, you know, painful, sad feelings come up in so many different kinds of contexts. Sorry, remind me of your question again, Tyrone.
Do people apologize? Does it take a while for them to feel?
I think people do, and I think maybe English people do more than American people do. There's a big sweeping generalization, and I'm sure.
I know we must make generalizations, but come on.
But, you know, I always have an interesting question to ask, which I guess I don't always ask, but I often do when somebody does cry, which is, what are your tears? What are your tears saying? If your tears could speak, what are they saying? And it's a very profound question, which often, you know, for me, tears are, you know, I guess for probably many years of experience, I mean, I'm certainly not uncomfortable sitting with somebody crying. And it's often a really important part of the work, because it shows that the defenses are down, that, you know, the feelings are really being allowed to be expressed. And, you know, in that very precious, vulnerable moment, you know, important work is happening. You know, the grief is manifest, you know, it's being expressed, and that really is the work. Not that we have to go around, you know, crying every minute because we've lost somebody significant, but it's, you know, not for everybody, and people have different emotional registers. And some people are quite weepy, and some people, you know, really struggle to cry. I'm not a big weeper myself, and I certainly have wept many times, but it's not something that, you know, I can tap into very easily. But I've often felt it's quite cathartic when I have been able to cry. And, you know, I often share with people as well, particularly going through, you know, really big emotions like grieving, you know, just to give yourself time. And really, you know, self-care is so important, because it's exhausting. You know, grieving is exhausting. It's really, you know, it's hard work. You know, in emotional terms, you are running a marathon. It's a lot of processing. It's a big toll on your energy, on your body, on your physical well-being. Don't be too demanding on yourself. You know, allow it to happen, whatever needs to happen, but also be gentle with yourself. Rest, be with kind people. Don't overburden yourself. And I think, you know, I'm actually working with somebody right now who's working on you know, a significant loss. And for them, you know, work has been this incredible sort of sticking plaster in a way. You know, it's you know, they have a very full-on career. It's very busy, and I think it's a very powerful distraction, which I think in some ways does have some real use. You know, but we need to acknowledge that it is a kind of distraction, and that it isn't where the work's going to happen. But nice to be able to have that to sort of dive into, in a sense, to give yourself some reprieve, but you do need to come back and do the work, which is what we're doing in the therapy space. And yeah, I mean, I always feel very honored to do this work. I mean, it's when I first was qualifying as a therapist, I did voluntary work for a bereavement service. So for the first couple of years, as I was gaining my hours before I was qualified as a therapist, I worked primarily in bereavement. And I don't know, it was something I always felt very comfortable doing. I don't know why, probably because of my own loss. You know, my ex, who I split up with, ended up, you know, tragically dying. And also over the years, I've lost some very key, significant people in my life. And I just have I think, you know, through my own experience, a very deep empathy with what grieving is and what it feels like. And it really is, you know, the heaviest emotional lifting of all, of whatever life throws at us. It really is, it's the big stuff. And to be able to be with somebody in that incredibly painful and vulnerable space is, you know, incredibly honoring, actually.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And I think it takes some personal experience potentially to, like you say, to really be in that compassionate space for people. Yeah, I was thinking also, again, I don't like to make sweeping generalizations, but I was trying to get more men to talk on this series, because I think there was 2 men last time. So that was a bit of feedback I had from people. How do you see in your work, or even, you know, with yourself, how men grieve differently to women?
I think, I mean, certainly me wearing my sort of therapy hat, I mean, I probably work generally slightly more with men than women. That may be about men perhaps feeling more comfortable talking to a guy. I mean, it really depends, I guess, what the issues are and what they're seeking help for. I just think, you know, taking a step back generally in our culture, you know, men expressing feelings of sadness, grief, you know, images of men crying, you know, showing, you know, that they're really expressing their grief and loss is just still culturally quite taboo, I think. It's not something that we tend to see in dramas, in movies. It's always sort of, is quite, I mean, I can be quite startled myself when you see that being presented in a, you know, in a movie or something, because it's not so expected. It's not so so usual, and it tends to sort of stand out. But I think, you know, those feelings of sadness, of that sort of, you know, despair, shock, you know, that empty feeling of just feeling literally gutted with the loss of this significant person, whoever they may be, is a universal experience. It's not in any way gendered. I mean, it's like, you know, for a man to lose his wife or a parent, I mean, these are huge, painful human emotions. But somehow culturally, it seems harder for men to feel comfortable expressing that or showing that. There's more of a sense of, you know, kind of stoicism or sort of grin and bear it, which I think is a real shame, because I think it can interfere with the grieving process, which, as I said before, needs to happen. But, you know, saying that, I also think, you know, there is you know, people do express different emotional registers, and the idea that if you're not sort of constantly bursting into tears, you're not really feeling, you know, the loss, or you're not really doing the grieving work, I think is just not true. I think people can experience, you know, I can feel terribly sad. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to start crying, but I know I'm processing or feeling that sadness. I can feel it in my body. I know what that feeling is like. And it may express itself as tears or it may not, but I think the feeling of sadness is still there. So I think perhaps, you know, just thinking about it, working with men around grieving, that perhaps are less tears, but I think the emotions are just as strong, and, you know, the pain is the pain. I mean, it's the work is the work. I think it's all the same, really, you know, when all's said and done, really. Yeah,
I think that's such a key point that you're raising, that it doesn't need to manifest as lots of outpouring of emotion, grief. And I called this series the Conscious Grief series, and I'd love to hear what that kind of conjures up for you, the idea of conscious grief, like what that is. Obviously, this is just your interpretation.
Well, I remember, Tara, when you shared that idea with me, and I was thinking that's such an interesting two words put together, because consciousness sort of implies a degree of more perhaps a more our rational minds, our sort of frontal cortex processing, our sort of our sort of thinking space, whereas grieving inevitably is a whole kind of melee of feelings and emotions, which may feel quite separate from our more sort of conscious processing. But I think to put them together is really interesting. So to me, conscious grieving is about both knowing and experiencing. So it's about knowing that grieving is part of, the experience of life inevitably. So it's having that sort of conscious awareness that losses will happen to us no matter who we are. So to some degree, thinking consciously about grieving, even if we may not be grieving at that particular time, to some degree might prepare us for the inevitability that we will grieve. Although I think when it can hit us, it can really knock us for six. And, certainly we've not had any other context in which to put this loss. It can be, feel for sure, absolutely overwhelming. So I think it's a really interesting, combination of words. So it's both using the sort of the whole of the mind in a way, both the sort of conscious, rational part of the mind to acknowledge that grieving is part of, the life experience, but also, that the grieving will be something that we'll go through in all its, pain and sadness and complexity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, grieving as well, it's not a box ticking exercise, and it can really be like wading through mud in a sense of, I'm never ever going to get through this. Am I ever going to feel joy again? Am I ever going to feel lightness? Am I ever going to laugh? Am I ever going to, really feel some of the real pleasures of life? Everything is just so heavy and dark. And, if we do the work, I think the joy can come back for sure. Absolutely. And yet it can still trip us up when we think we've absolutely, done so much processing. And, funny enough, just literally this week, I had a really powerful dream about my ex from all those years ago, someone who's not appeared in a dream for so many years. And it was actually, it triggered some this really sort of deep emotion in me of sadness and not being able to speak to them again. And, it was a kind of much more muted form of that grief I went through all those years ago. But I was like, wow, it's still there. It's still there. And I don't know quite what triggered that dream or why or something. I don't know what's going on in the world right now is very triggering in a way. But, for me, it was, a reminder in a way that pain is there, and it in a sense it will never be gone. But that's also in a way an acknowledgement of the power of that relationship and the meaningfulness of that relationship and the love in that relationship. We can only feel the pain, dependent on the power of the love that we felt for that person or thing or situation, which is really what makes life worth living.
It's so true. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, David. And it's just something, like you say, that becomes part of us, and not to feel like we term these sorts of emotions as negative emotions, rather than think of it as a negative thing. Like you're saying, it's like this beautiful part of us that feels, that loves deeply. And when we love deeply, then we feel deeply, and then we feel pain deeply as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I've known people in my life, but also certainly in my therapy work as well, who are incredibly frightened of intimacy, incredibly frightened of, true, vulnerable, meaningful connection because of that risk, because of that risk of it, being lost in some way, that almost it's too frightening. I'm not saying that they're somehow wrong to think that, but it can lead to a much more cautious life being lived if we're not willing to step into that more vulnerable place, which is really where, you know, the real highs can happen of real connection and you know, meaningful relationships and love and so on. But also, you know, we're opening ourselves up to that vulnerability too, of, you know, how would we manage if that didn't work out, or if it went wrong, or, you know, the relationship ended, or they passed away, or whatever else may happen. And for some of us, that feels too risky.
Yeah, and that's where someone like you can really help support and guide somebody to step into that courage, you know, of intimacy and and not be afraid. David, I absolutely have loved speaking to you. Is there anything else that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
Well, just thank you, Tara. I really appreciate you reaching out. I guess, I mean, it may sound a little strange, but I'm very passionate about this. So thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you today. It's really been a pleasure. And I guess if I wanted to sign off in any way, I would just, I don't know, there's something about the courage to feel. I think, you know, to grieve takes courage. It's work. It's some of the hardest work we can ever do. Wonderful the support you're offering, Tara, through your groups and, you know, your conscious grieving, which I think is really important. You know, and to let people know that you also don't need to suffer in silence or suffer alone, that there is support out there. That, you know, it's really helpful to talk. You know, hopefully we all have somebody we can turn to, whether it's a friend, relative, whoever, that, you know, will give us the space and the kindness to really listen to us. And also, if you are in that listening role, if someone comes to you who you're close to, who's grieving, you know, I mean, it sounds a bit odd, but try not to fix them.
Yeah.
Just allow them to be whatever they need to be and whatever they need to say, and just give them space and listen. I think that's probably the best gift, or the gift of all, when somebody close to you is grieving.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, David. And I hope that we'll remain in touch and keep talking. Yeah.
Thanks, Tara. All the best.